Next we have electronophones. And I'm sure you figured out by the name we're dealing with the kinds of electronic instruments that are part of the 20th century. The most modern ones that many people across the world know about are digital keyboards or electronic keyboards. You probably also know about electric guitars, electric basses. It started actually earlier in the 20th century, and some of the first instruments were electronic organs for churches. And we used to have, of course, churches back in Europe and in America where they built pipe organs, big organs and big sets of pipes. And those, of course, were very expensive. As we had more and more churches developing in the 1800s and the 1900s, there were congregations and new denominations of Christianity in particular that wanted to use the organ but couldn't afford those big pipe installations. So there were a couple of inventors that created something that sounds similar to those kinds of big organs, but they made sounds electronically. You can see an example of that in the largest photo here in this slide, and you can see that we've got a church choir. You can see the stained glass windows and the architecture of the church, and we have a man who's recording the choir, and we have someone who's accompanying them on what looks like it maybe even be a piano size instrument, but that's actually an electronic organ. They also became very popular in gospel music, and then in American gospel music, and then became part of rock and roll and rock and R&B and other kinds of popular styles. So of course, as you've already figured out, this is a category of instruments whose sounds are primarily produced by controlled electrical voltage. The fancy word here is that this voltage is transduced or converted into musical pitches. So you see the organ in the large photo, you see a typical rock and roll concert or a rock concert type of setup with a keyboard stand with several different electronic keyboards, and you see a bass player, probably from a rock or punk kind of band. Probably the easiest way to get this idea across is to show you a typical rock era keyboardist with his setup of multiple keyboards. This is Rick Wakeman from the group Yes. Sometimes they call the genre of popular music that they play progressive rock. Before we go on to this next section where you try to identify instruments by looking at the photos, I want to say a little bit about Rick Wakeman and his performance on that YouTube video. You notice that he had kind of a semicircle of keyboards. I didn't count them out myself, but it's probably 6 or 7 keyboards there. And the first thing he played sounded like a grand piano, although it was an electronic keyboard. Then you heard some string kinds of sounds, so he could create pretty much the sound of an entire orchestra with his electronic keyboards. And I always found that fascinating, how much music one hand or two hands and 10 fingers can come up with when you're using electronic keyboards.